I did a couple presentations on Zoom, which is interesting in itself. So.
Perfect. So with that, we are live. Welcome everyone. Sunday
Cool.
night with author historian John Rees here. He has graciously decided to put his reputation on the line by joining us here at Emerging Red War. So we thank you, John. John is the author of a recently published book, They Were Good Soldiers, African Americans Serving in the Continental Army. So great topic to have, one that has needed a detailed study, and John's book actually breaks it down by the 13 states and so forth. So give you a little bit of a background. So we'll kick it off. Welcome, John. First question we'll ask you is if someone walked up to you in a pub and bar and said, what's your book about in 5 seconds or less, what would be the initial introduction?
African American soldiers in an integrated American army.
We like that. So that leads to the second question. Why this topic? What got you onto talking about African American Continentals?
Well, I first started reading and research about the period about 1985, I guess. I joined Living History in '84, and when I first started doing research, it was just a pretty narrow subject. It was on the unit I belonged to, was the 5th Pennsylvania Battalion. But as I researched, I would come across cool information, and at that point, right away, I started scrolling it away. I just copied it and put it off to the side. And of course, eventually, I started coming into information on Black soldiers in the Continental Army, or actually just African American soldiers during the war, really. And so I put those aside with the rest of my information, and I just started getting more and more. I eventually read Benjamin Quarles's Negroes in the American Revolution, which for a book written in the 1960s is still a great book. And then at some point, probably around the early 2000s, I realized I had enough material for an article. I ended up doing 2 articles on the subject. One like an overview. The second had to do with African American soldiers in Southern Continental regiments. And the second one's still online, actually. And then I happened to be on LinkedIn for Lord knows what reason, because I really don't need it for work. But an editor at Hellion Press in the UK contacted me one time because I'd posted one of my articles on Black soldiers and said, would you be interested in doing a book? And on this subject or any subject you wanted to do it on. So I thought about it for maybe 5 minutes and thought, yeah, I want to do it on Black soldiers.
So it got started. So with your research with the 5th Pennsylvania, did that lead into, was that the first African American Continentals kind of you found from the state of Pennsylvania, or did you have to go north or south? Or?
Well, actually, there was one reference. It was there was a drummer named Polydor, or also he was also called Polydor Negro. So they had at least one Black drummer in the regiment. And it was a 1-year unit. It actually was captured pretty much entirely at the Battle of Fort Washington. But there was that one reference. So that was my first reference. Even though, I mean, even when I was young, I knew about Crispus Attucks. I mean, I loved history even as a kid. And then around 1978, they put out Revolutionary War stamps, the U.S. Post Office, and one of them was I think it was Salem Poor. So that kind of let me know that there were besides Crispus Attucks in the Boston Massacre, there were actually Black soldiers in the Army, and so I knew about them before, but I'd never done any research on them.
I mean, before this, obviously, before reading your book, I knew about it was the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. Everyone has heard about them out of Rhode Island, and then also about the the Royal Ethiopian Regiment, and then so forth. So, we'll go from north to south. So, talking about the New England states first. What was interesting about finding these African Americans from New England? Were there like particular regional differences?
Well, the one thing about New England is I mean the war the war basically kicked off in New England. Of course, April 19th, Lexington conquered, and the whole running battle back to Boston. But on that day, from the first, there were black militiamen, some in the minute companies that served that day, and they were free and slave. And there was one black militiaman wounded on Lexington Green. So again, they were in the fight from the first. It was also during that first year that they questioned the fact of African Americans in the ranks, that they thought, well, do we really want black soldiers? I mean, they'd already fought. By the time they questioned that, they questioned the presence of slaves, which is probably understandable. I think Philip Schuyler said, should we have slaves fighting for our freedom? But by the time they really questioned that, they had already fought at Bunker Hill and Lexington and Concord, and they'd also fought during the French and Indian War too. So they proved they were good soldiers. So that's where in 1775 that question, that their presence in the army gets questioned, and then basically by the end of the year, it's like, no, we're going to allow black soldiers in the army, and that was it for the rest of the war. It's interesting though, because in the New England states, I think it was William Heath wrote that there was a number of black soldiers and some Indian soldiers in the Massachusetts regiments. In Connecticut, they had more Indian soldiers than black soldiers, and in Rhode Island there was a mix of both too. And he's writing in 1775. So they were, and the service of black soldiers and Indian soldiers kind of goes hand in hand. It's an interesting dichotomy right there. I think one of the things that stands out about the New England regiments, especially probably Connecticut and Massachusetts, is that there were a number of enslaved soldiers that fought, and most of them, maybe not all of them, but most of them received their freedom in return for service. That was somewhat true for the rest of the colonies, but there were also times when, I know there's one Virginia soldier, I think his name was Dabney. He was promised his freedom when he went in to serve for his master, and basically at the end of his service, he was taken back into slavery, and he finally got his freedom some years after the war. But his master didn't hold up his end of the bargain.
Was that typical from the research you found, these bargains being reneged by masters or so forth, or were they usually pretty truthful or trustworthy to saying, yeah, your freedom was warranted for your service?
From what I've seen, by and large, if an enslaved soldier served, he got his freedom for his service. And then of course there was also post-war in Virginia, I think it was about 1785, they passed an act that they would free enslaved men who had served during the war, and that was not just in a militia or the Continentals, but also included, there were slaves who were freed because they had worked in the salt mines. As long as they had contributed to the war effort, they were freed. And so a number of slaves post-war got their freedom that way too.
So I know one of these stories, so Rob Orson and myself had co-written a book, an introductory book on Lexington and Concord, and then doing some of the research took us to the Longfellow, what became the Longfellow House there in Cambridge, and we used as Washington's headquarters. And it really, Washington's first reaction, to African-American troops there is kind of surprising. Because he is a Virginia gentleman and sees these troops there. So we know his reaction. This is a very detailed question, but did any African Americans relay their initial thoughts on General Washington?
Not that I know of. It's interesting because there's one white soldier, Josiah Atkins, who served in the 1781 Light Infantry. He was from Connecticut, and he's one of the few that I actually found that actually commented on Washington. But his is interesting because He served in Lafayette's 1781 Light Battalions. He actually he went down as a recruit for those battalions. So he didn't go down when the battalions first went. He actually went past Mount Vernon, and he had some really pithy comments about slavery, and because it was unlike slavery that they knew it in the North. I mean, you had massive plantations that were fueled by great numbers of slaves, and unfortunately, it didn't make it in my book. But he really tears apart the revolutionary leaders who relied on slavery for their living and for their for the livelihood.
Yeah, for the so we'll leave that at that, because I know we have a few Washington fans, so we want to make sure your book still sells in the Southern colony or former Southern colonies there. So as you move, from doing
another. I mean, before we go on, it may be that Washington may have started changing his views, maybe even before the war, because of equal rights to men. But he may have started changing his views about slavery during the war. I mean, he did emancipate his slaves in his will, so he did do that. But a lot of Revolutionary veterans had really liberal views about slavery. They were pretty much anti-slavery, and it seems that Washington may actually been affected by that during the war. So that can be said for him and for the war too, or at least for the revolutionary cause
as well. And I mean, if you take for granted, the basic line is that if you were able to suffer through the winters of Morristown, Valley Forge, or no pay, no food, and so forth, you create those bonds that kind of, you see that later in other conflicts as well. I mean, with USET troops and the Civil War is, hey, once these guys have the common suffering of serving in war, kind of changes your views on certain aspects. So,
sure.
I've been researching for a book on introductory book on Valley Forge, and once you survived out of that, you kind of have that hard knit group, and you even see some of the Native Americans that served at like Barron Hill with Lafayette.
Yeah. Yep.
But so if there's so before we move from New England, is there one? If someone's like, okay, I want to go visit a spot where Continental African Americans played a major role in some type of combat, would it be where would you point them, or where would be one place you think they should visit?
Well, I'll point them to one place that I consider really special. Is Monmouth Battlefield. I mean, if nobody has visited Monmouth Battlefield, they really should. And what's little known about Monmouth Battlefield is, well, again, to get back to the first Rhode Island Regiment, the so-called Black Regiment, that actually began the war began its service as an integrated regiment with black and white soldiers. It wasn't until the Valley Forge winter that the Rhode Island decided to recruit enslaved African Americans and Indians and fill a regiment with them. That regiment basically was recruited in Rhode Island and stayed in Rhode Island. But when all the officers of the first Rhode Island went back to Massachusetts, or went back to Rhode Island to recruit the regiment, the African Americans and Indians, they left all the veteran soldiers with the second Rhode Island, and among those were a good number of African American soldiers who had been veterans of some of 1775, some of 1776, and the rest from 1777. So they were formed into a single company of 60 men. At the Battle of Monmouth, if anybody has read Gary Stone and Mark Lender's book, Fatal Sunday, they'll know about the hedgerow defensive action. So the Rhode Island troops went forward under General Lee to basically face the British rear guard, which was made up of basically the flower of the British Army, the Lights and the Grenadiers. They eventually were forced to retreat, and at one point a portion of the troops came to it was called the hedgerow position. It was a hedge fence, and it was right before it was called a morass, the Northwood Middlebrook. And in order to cover the retreating troops, they decided to form Varner Brigade and a number of other regiments at this hedgerow to face the British. Alongside the first Rhode Island or the second Rhode Island Regiment was the segregated Black Company of the first Rhode Island, with all the Black veterans in it. So they actually fought at that defensive position. You can actually go there and still see where they fought. Right behind that position is a place called Oswald's Knoll, which was they were actually covering the artillery on the right flank. So there's a round knoll where you can see where the artillery was. The hedgerow position is still marked. I think they fired about at least 8 to 10 rounds. And considering the conditions, because the British were coming at them pell-mell, pretty much not in a very good formation. They basically assaulted them pretty quickly. So it was a short-lived defensive stand, but it was really hotly fought. So that's where I would point them. There are others too, but that's my favorite.
So to our audience who does not know, John Rees is actually a expert on Monmouth Courthouse. I've been told by one of my compatriots that you're able to give a whole battlefield tour without even being in sight of the battlefield. Someone could you can direct them by what road or so forth. Is there any truth?
It's much more fun being on the battlefield because it's a well preserved site. So if anybody has a chance to go there, it's great. And I'll give you my email if they want some tips on what to see. I mean, if I can't be there myself, I can give them some tips to where to go and what to see too.
So you hear that? So instead of publicly broadcasting his email to everyone on the internet, if you are on the way to Monmouth or you will have any questions about Monmouth, just shoot an email to the blog, and we'll make sure that John gets it so he can respond. So that way he doesn't get spam from any from around the country here. Everything. We don't want to blow up your inbox too much there. So Monmouth, I mean, yeah, it's from what I've studied and everything, having the chance to briefly go by it when I was working at Morristown. It's good to hear about Monmouth and not hear the words Charles Lee in part of the sentence. So as we move from Monmouth, we go into the middle colonies. I'm originally from Baltimore, Maryland, so I know that Maryland was filling their quota with anybody they could. Interesting accounts from the mid colonies on African Americans and service. What you found in there?
Well, let's see. We'll reserve Delaware and Maryland for the southern colonies because that's so. But let's go with New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. New Jersey probably had about 20 African Americans that served, maybe 25, maybe as much as 30 in the Continental regiments, but they not really that many considering. New York had a pretty good proportion of African American soldiers. But the one thing I want to point out is it's interesting because Pennsylvania had very few. In August 1778, there was a return of it's called the Return of Negroes in 15 brigades of Washington's army. So that's post Monmouth. So it gives a good indication of how many African Americans were at Monmouth if you take away the brigades that weren't there. But on that return, there were 2 Pennsylvania brigades. One had 2 African Americans, the other had none, which is really, really interesting. It really stands out from all the other states. I mean, and that's North and South. If you look at like Virginia, North Carolina's numbers of African Americans in the regiments compare pretty much favorably with Massachusetts and Connecticut. So there's not much difference between Southern regiments and Northern regiments with African Americans in the ranks. As far as why there weren't many African Americans in the Pennsylvania regiments, in August 1777, Pennsylvania passed its first militia law. Before that, they were associators, and it's because it was a Quaker state. They didn't believe in fighting. They didn't believe in bearing arms. So starting, I think, in the 1740s, they started these military associations. So it was a voluntary organization of people who wanted to join and form what was basically a militia unit, but it was voluntary instead of drafted by the state. The 1777 Pennsylvania law basically barred African Americans from serving with militia, and it seems they may have just transferred that over to the Continental line. There is at least one African American I know that served from at least 1777 all the way through to 1783, and he was wounded at the Battle of Brandywine. And he left a great, he left a relatively simple pension deposition, but I can flesh it out with some other sources too. So there were African Americans in the Pennsylvania ranks, but they had very, very few. So that's the standout for me for the middle states.
As we move to the southern colonies, and there was always a debate where Maryland falls.
Yeah.
We have a question from Robert Ryan, a loyal watcher of our Zooms, asking, were there any African American or Black soldiers that fought in the Delaware and/or Maryland line as enlisted soldiers?
Yes, there were more. I mean, Delaware, of course, is really special because it was such a small contingent. It was a single regiment for the entire war, and there were African Americans that fought in that. I'm still trying to find early war, like 1777. I'm pretty sure 1776 in both the Maryland and Delaware regiments in 1776, at least Smallwoods in the Delaware regiment. I haven't been able to find. I'm pretty sure there were no African Americans serving then in those lines. I think in 1777 is where you start to see them come in. But I haven't found any that early for the Delaware regiment yet. I found them for 1781 and later. And it's interesting because if you talk about slaves being, their freedom being taken away from them, there's actually some African Americans who were basically claimed by their masters. It may have been that they enlisted in the Delaware regiment without their master's permission, and basically they were claimed by their masters and taken back. But in the Maryland line, there's a man named Thomas Carney. He actually fought in the Maryland militia in 77. I think he was a German. I think it was a Germantown in 77 with a Maryland militia. He joined the Continental regiments, the Maryland Continental Regiment in the spring of 1778, and then fought through to the end of the war. And at the Siege of 96, he's actually cited for bravery, at least in his obituary. He's cited for bravery for basically taking his wounded colonel back behind the lines to get him medical treatment, and then wanting to go back into the fight, but they told him to stay with his colonel. At least it was the field officer. I think it was the colonel. But he's one of the. I actually have a blog on that basically. It basically is an adjunct to my book where I can actually either correct information, put new information in, and I have a blog post just on newspaper accounts of African American soldiers, 19th century, and I have Carney's obituary in there. And after the war, his colonel didn't forget him. He would still get together with him sometimes during militia muster days post-war. So Thomas Carney, I mean, he fought. I think he was at Guilford Courthouse. I think he probably would have been at Cowpens too, or he might have been at Cowpens. I'm not sure. But that's a one of the standouts for me.
I'm glad one of the standouts is from Maryland, because I'm always trying to. I've been called a homer about Maryland, but I mean, we do have the Maryland line is a staple of both the Northern and Southern armies from multiple battles.
Sure.
So let's before we jump back into the Southern colonies, another great question came in. It says, do you have a general number of how many African Americans joined the Patriot Army versus the British, and secondary question, the motivations? Does anyone leave the motivation of joining one side or the other?
Well, let's switch to British Army first. And actually, I want to, you mentioned the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. By and large, African Americans that served in the Continental Army and the militia were integrated into the ranks. On the American side, the one standout, the one exception to that rule was the Rhode Island Regiment. That was except for a few individual companies in other units. That was the only segregated regiment. Now that had, of course, black officers, I mean, white officers and white non-commissioned officers. Now, let's go to the French. The French had the, I forget the name of it, but it was a regiment raised in Saint-Domingue, which of course later became Haiti. So that was their all black regiment, and their first service was in 1779. They fought at the Battle of Savannah. And I think Toussaint Louverture and a number of other African Americans who formed Haiti fought in that regiment, or at least got their inspiration from that regiment. On the British side, the black regiment was Dunmore's Royal Ethiopians, and that was in 1775 when Virginia Governor Lord Dunmore basically was chased out of the capital, Williamsburg. Made his headquarters on board a British ship, and then started raiding the Virginia coast, and basically freeing slaves. So he took those slaves and put them into he decided to put them into a military unit, the Ethiopian regiment. It was only a unit for 1 year, from roughly August of 1775 to August of 1776. They fought at the Battle of Great Bridge. Great Bridge, of course, was a debacle for the British. Also at the Great Bridge, there was I think it was William Flora fought in the Virginia militia on that side. So that was probably the first instance of African Americans on both sides facing each other, even though the Ethiopian regiment wasn't, I don't think, in the thick of it. Some of them were captured, wounded and captured there. I think it was early 1777. Well, at the end of their service, they were taken back in like September 1776. They were shipped north to New York. And at that point, they were disbanded, and they may have joined the Black Pioneers, which was a segregated black corps. They were basically military laborers for the British Army, and others just might have gone into the population in New York, and they may have done labor for the British Army in other ways. In 1777, early 1777, William Howe, who was then commander of the British Army in America, basically put out a decree that banned African Americans from serving in Loyalist regiments, and those are Crown supported Loyalist regiments, and also British regiments. So any that were serving in those regiments were discharged. Now that was eventually lightened up to they eventually took on. In fact, they may have retained them, but British regiments and Loyalist regiments still had black musicians. So through to the end of the war, they pretty much had black musicians. But any African Americans that were associated with Loyalist regiments that were Crown supported, or British regiments, were probably either servants or musicians. They weren't arms bearing. Now that was different for Loyalist militia and Loyalist irregular units. There was in South Carolina, there was the Black Dragoons. That was a black cavalry unit. I don't think it was as large as a regiment. I'm not sure how large it became. And then, of course, in New Jersey, you had Colonel Tighe's brigade, which was actually an integrated unit of white and black loyalists that were stationed at Sandy Hook Lighthouse, Sandy Hook, New Jersey, and they were commanded by a black loyalist, Colonel Tighe. His name was Titus. He had been a slave in Monmouth County. Some stories say that he actually escaped and served in Dunmore's regiment, and then went back to New Jersey and he fought for about a year and a half, and eventually was killed in battle. And the Hessian units actually had some African Americans too, either as musicians or what they called land connects. They were either servants or they were wagoners, carters, or pack horsemen. But as far as numbers, there were probably, I think I've seen one estimate of like 15,000 serving in the British Army at one point, at any point during the war. Now, thousands of slaves escaped and joined the British, or went into the British lines, and of course were freed at the end of the war. A lot of them were sent to Nova Scotia. Some were sent to the West Indies, which is where definitely a lot of them didn't want to go. Some were sent to Sierra Leone and other places in Africa. So it was in the thousands for the African Americans that served in some way for the British forces. The best estimate we have for American forces is about 5,000. Now that's land forces and naval forces, because there were quite a number of African Americans serving in either privateers or in the Continental Navy or the state navies. Now that August 1778 brigade or 1778 return of Negroes in 15 brigades of Washington's army, in a force of about 18,000, it showed about 755 African Americans, which I think was about 4.2%. Now that may not seem a lot, but actually, if you add the African Americans in the Rhode Island line and the African Americans in the New Jersey who are not in return, I think it comes to about 950 or so total, if you include Rhode Islanders and New Jersey. But if you would just separate those are all integrated. If you would separate all those out, 755 Black soldiers from that one return, and put them into two regiments, they could form two regiments. Now they would have been understrength regiments, but they still would have been at least on a par or actually greater in strength than most other Continental regiments, because most Continental regiments were understrength. So basically they added two regiments to the army at that point. And one French officer estimated that 25% of Washington's army in 1781 was comprised Black soldiers. I think that's an exaggeration, but I think their numbers actually did increase for a lot of reasons later in the war. And I would say probably at least 8 to 10% of Washington's army in 1781 was African American soldiers. So, I think the number of free Blacks it's estimated that 500,000 African Americans were in the population in the colonies. Now that's about 20% of the population. But if out of that 500,000, only 50,000 were free. Of the total population in the colonies and later the states, that's about, I think it's about 4%, maybe a little higher than that. So, for the numbers of free Blacks that were in the population, the numbers that were served in the army was actually, pretty good, because the percentage actually, the percentage of Blacks in the overall population, the free Blacks, also includes women too. So, like I said, the numbers may seem small, but they actually made a difference, and that doesn't take into account the number of men that served in the militias too, because North and South, the militia had African American men.
The follow-up, I mean, the obvious thing with motivation would be for their freedom, but did you come across any other motivating factors? Family, better life, travel, anything of that nature?
Well, the thing is, and actually, I talk about this a little bit in my book, but I actually just did a teacher's workshop, and that was one of the questions that the teachers asked a lot of. And Mike Scoggins, who unfortunately since passed away, but he did some work on African American soldiers, and he did a nice little, just a paragraph of what he thought the motivations were, and they basically agreed with what I found. Their motivations were pretty much the same as white soldiers. Some of them joined for adventure. Most of the Continental soldiers were relatively young. Anybody that's read Joseph Plum Martin's account, I mean, he was a white Connecticut soldier who first served in 1776. You can see, the reasons why some soldiers, he joined for the adventure and basically to get away from home and work but just for adventure. I mean, African American soldiers did the same thing. Some of them joined because they believed in the cause of independence for America. Some of them because they believed that all men were created equal. They along with a large proportion of white citizens, they believed in that revolutionary ideal set out in the Declaration of Independence. Some of them joined because their neighbors were joining. and or the neighbors would join in and they had a chance to serve with either their friends or their neighbors, the people they knew, which made a difference. Some joined because they felt they were defending their homes. And then, of course, there are others who felt that they really believed, along with many whites, that all men were created equal, and they fought to make that true. And then, of course, you had the African Americans, the enslaved African Americans who fought for their own freedom. There was a slave. I think his master's name was Whipple, but at one point, this slave had already fought at the Battle of Trenton. And when at one point his master noticed he was kind of looking sad, looking down, and he asked his enslaved servant, why he felt that way, and he said to his master, you're fighting for your freedom, but I have nothing to fight for. His master, either then or eventually, freed him because of that. So there are instances of that. I mean, there was the artist Charles Wilson Peale served in the Philadelphia Associators. He served at the Battle of Princeton, and I was just reading a piece just today by Nathaniel Green, basically saying how well the Associators fought at the Battle of Princeton. For troops who had never, and again, they were basically militia, for troops who had never been in action before. They had blacks in their ranks. They might have been, I don't know if they had musket-bearing African Americans in their ranks, but they did have musicians in their ranks. And earlier in 1775, 76, the Philadelphia Associators were very radical along the lines of Thomas Paine. And they were actually buying the slaves. I mean, it was basically a forced purchase off of loyalists, and then freeing them. And some of them they enrolled into the Philadelphia Associators. So it's there's a whole variety of reasons, but again, the equality of men and against slavery is at least a part of it.
It's good to hear. I mean, because most people would say, "Oh, it's probably for their freedom," and then chalk it up. Like, we always like putting motivations in these nice little.
Oh yeah. But they were that's the fun thing about history, is the more you read history, you realize that times were different, life could be harder or just different, or just a lot different, but they were still human beings. And that's white, black, Native American, and sometimes they did things for stupid reasons or petty reasons or insignificant reasons, and sometimes they did things that for really lofty reasons. It just runs the whole gamut.
And so, as we talk about the whole gamut, we'll move into those southern colonies. You've already mentioned, of course, the Battle of Savannah, and you're right. Joe Tour was there. I had a chance to stop by Savannah, and it's the engagement there was multicultural. I mean, you had I think a British officer that hailed from Switzerland, and all these other nationalities. But in the southern colonies, most one of the names that pops up is, of course, John Laurens, who petitioned to raise African American troops in South Carolina for service in exchange for their freedom. But as we move into the southern colonies, feel free to talk about him or anybody else. What's your favorite account or so forth as you move into
let's start with Laurens, because I mean, his father was a wealthy plantation owner who owned at least hundreds of slaves. I don't know the exact number. He was also president of Congress for a period. And when Laurens early on, he actually served as a volunteer aide for Washington. And in 1778, when John Laurens got the idea to raise a regiment of freed slaves in South Carolina, his father, who was then president of Congress, again, who was a large slave owner, backed him. I mean, this was put before Congress. I mean, it would have required a congressional vote and congressional okay. And his father went to the Mat Forum in support of trying to raise this regiment of freed slaves. The Congress voted it down, so it never came to be. But that would have been another segregated black regiment that would have fought. Now from, Maryland on down, South Carolina, Georgia less so, but there were African Americans that fought in Georgia. There were African Americans that fought and were captured at the Battle of Charleston in 1780. I have a number of those in the book. There were South Carolina soldiers. And again, the North Carolina and Virginia numbers, if you look at that August 1778 return, the percentage of African Americans in their brigades as opposed to Connecticut and Massachusetts brigades they're similar. They're in the top 6. You have three New England brigades and 3 Southern brigades. But there's one soldier in particular, and he's a Virginia soldier. His name's Andrew Pebble. I think he joined in 1777. He joined I think it was the 11th Virginia. Pretty much right away, he was taken out to serve in an artillery unit. Now, which was pretty common. There were men drafted from the infantry to serve in the artillery, mostly as matrosses, which were basically artillery laborers. They pulled the guns and did other stuff. Eventually, he was transferred to Lee's Legion, which of course was Light Horse Henry Lee's unit, and of course Henry Lee was the father of Robert E. Lee. So here we have an African American soldier serving in Lee's Legion, which was a mix of cavalry and infantry, and was considered a relatively elite unit. He fought at the Battle of Eutaw Springs, where he was wounded twice. Actually, I think he was wounded 3 times during the war. And he leaves a nice little pension. Now, the interesting thing about Pebbles and some other soldiers I found is that post-war, he wrote in the early 18th century that he was living with his daughter and wife, but he had no use of he couldn't use their labor to support the family because they were slaves. So he was a free man with an enslaved daughter and wife, and all their labor was basically taken by the master. I have 2 other Virginia soldiers who said the same thing, and that's only what I found in the pension file. So there had to be quite a number of other soldiers in other situations like that, where they had family members who were enslaved while they were free. I do want to talk about, just to get back to Pennsylvania for a second. Pennsylvania is really interesting because, as I said, they don't have very many African Americans in the ranks in the Continental Army or militia. But post-war is really interesting. Post-war, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society was rechartered. I think it was 1786 or so. At that point, a large number of Pennsylvania Revolutionary veterans, military veterans, joined the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, and they basically held on to that revolutionary ideal of all men are created equal well into their old age. In 1820, during the Missouri crisis, they went to the mat to basically try to bar Missouri from coming into the Union as a slave state. So much so that and there were some other veterans in other states, but Pennsylvania was the core of it. And these are revolutionary veterans, and some of them were actually ready to go to war with the South at that point. That's 1820, and they made it known that they were ready to go to war with the South. Joseph Bloomberg, another revolutionary veteran in New Jersey, basically finally kind of defused the situation and helped bring about the Missouri Compromise. In fact, one Pennsylvania veteran, an officer, his name's Forrest. I can't remember his name, his first name, but he served with Proctor's artillery. He was pretty crucial in the Battle of Trenton. He basically stood up in Congress and said that if slavery was expanded due to his role in the Revolutionary War, he said then that would have been the blackest period in his life. In other words, he would have totally repudiated his revolutionary service if slavery was expanded in the U.S., United States.
Those are strong words there.
Yeah.
Before we move on, one question that came in to just clarify something. In this, you said earlier, very few African Americans served in Pennsylvania, and then highlighted the radical association group that took loyalist slaves into their unit. Can you, I think we might have combined 2 topics there in that comment, but you were can you elaborate a little bit on that? The difference, what that radical association group that took loyalist slaves in?
Well, the associators that was 1776. So that was before the formation of actual Pennsylvania militia. They were voluntary associations. They weren't state run. And as I said, the Pennsylvania or the Philadelphia Associators in particular seem to have been they were really immersed in revolutionary ideal. So they were not under that. They didn't come into that 1777 law that barred African Americans from serving in the militia, and it also seems the Continental regiments too. So whatever they did basically was on their own hook. As long as the commander of the battalion was okay with it, then that was fine. And if you need to read about, I think it's Stephen Rossworm's book. I think it's called Arms and Independence. It's about the Philadelphia Associators during the Revolutionary War. And they remained relatively radical, at least a portion of them, pretty much through the end of the war. Another interesting thing about Pennsylvania is that in 1775, Chester County Committee of Safety started to formulate an abolition law. It never went anywhere until finally in 1780, Pennsylvania passed the only wartime abolition law passed by any state. Now that actually was a gradual abolition law, but it was actually pretty radical in its own right. And again, it's the only wartime abolition law that was passed, and that came from the 1775 Chester County Resolves that basically were the foundation of that law. I mean, Quaker had relatively large abolitionist population early on, even before the war, but that's because of the Quaker element. Quakers were basically the first ones who were really the core of the abolition movement. But during the war, more and more people jumped on board the abolition movement, and post-war, it went beyond just Quakers and into more and more of the general population.
As we wrap up here with about 10 minutes left, we have some good questions come in. One also from Emerging Rev War. We posted it. Any of these African Americans we talked about enlisted, did any of them become officers, or was that even frowned upon? I know in the Civil War it was discussed, but in the American Revolution, any of these African American soldiers rise to the rank of officer? No.
The only one that I know of is so-called, and it wasn't an official rank, but would have been Colonel Titus, who led the brigade in the Loyalist Brigade in New Jersey. And very few African Americans became non-commissioned officers too. There were 3 in the Rhode Island line, in the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, and that was only because since the Rhode Island Regiment, the segregated regiment, had white non-commissioned officers, at a certain point they didn't have enough white non-commissioned officers, so they actually made 3 African Americans NCOs. I think they're all corporals. And then when the Black Rhode Island Regiment, the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, was incorporated with the 2nd Rhode Island to form a single regiment, they were all demoted. So they were only for a short period. There's actually a possibility of 1 African American being a sergeant in Virginia, at least later war. I'm still trying to find that. Larry Babbitts and Josh Howard in their book, I think Guilford Courthouse, mention them. But other than that, no. Now, but that does bring up the mention of their treatment in the Continental Army during the war. And from what I can see in both the Continental Army and the state militias, they were treated pretty much like white soldiers. Now, early on, it seems that there may have been in 1776, maybe into 77, they may have been taken out for labor duties more than white soldiers. But by 1778, they were all doing duty together. I mean, at its most basic, they were given the same clothes, the same rations as white soldiers and Indian soldiers. They were given the same pay. Pay is a big thing. You were talking about the United States colored regiments during the Civil War. That was a huge thing during the Civil War because African-American soldiers in the Civil War in federal units were paid less than white soldiers. It wasn't the case during the Revolutionary War. So by and large, they were treated, I mean, the equal of white soldiers.
And then the other question that came in, that is interesting. I mean, about pay, I didn't even think about asking that. That was a good time. Any of the African-American or Black soldiers awarded the Legion of Merit during the war? Do you know about?
Well, trying to think. There was a late war distinction. Is basically what came to become known as the Purple Heart. Very few soldiers. Yeah, it was the badge of merit actually. Very few soldiers were awarded that, but and all the ones that I know were none were African American. But they were, if in 1782, if you would, they actually had badges of distinction for veterans, and there were basically chevrons on your soldiers. I think it was one chevron for each 3 year service. So if you served 6 years, you got two chevrons. It was an 8-year-long war. And in the discharge papers of some of the African-American soldiers, it says on there that they were entitled to wear that badge of merit. I mean that distinction of a veteran. They in the discharge papers, they actually call it a badge of merit. But the actual badge that's based on the Purple Heart is an entirely different award that was only given to certain soldiers.
And then the last question that we'll talk about in this one is, did you come across any documents praising these Black soldiers?
Yes, early on in 1775-76, General William Heath in Massachusetts, General John Thomas of Massachusetts, they're basically saying that they're fine soldiers. There are French officer who I can't remember his name now. He basically talked about how well they fought. A German officer in 1777 talked about the number of African Americans in all the regiments and the militia, and how well they served. He talked about how robust they were, how well made they were. And then post-war, there was a white veteran writing his memoirs after the war, and he wrote there were 4 names. I can't remember. They were all Connecticut soldiers. One of them they had served from anywhere from 2 years to up to like six years. And he says, he named them. He said they came to visit me after the war, and he said they were good soldiers. I mean, this is a man who had no reason to say that. I mean, it wasn't to ingratiate with himself with anybody, but in his memoirs, that's what he wrote. They were good soldiers.
That's good. We'll start to wrap up here, but I do have to make, and if you go to our blog, when we were writing the post about this Zoom, we asked John for a good quote or so, and he gave the one from Baron Ludwig, von Closen. And I thought
von Closen, that's it, yeah.
By the aide-de-camp. But John's book is available on Amazon, available, I think, directly from the publisher. Is that correct? I think
it's in the U.S. It's available from Casemate Publishing, and they're in Pennsylvania, or again Amazon.
And so, but if you need the book signed, we will have John next May. We're supposed to have him in September, hindsight 2020, but we're doing our Emerging Rebel War Symposium in May of 2021. So go to our blog to look up for links and tickets. That way John can sign that book for you. We're doing hindsights in 2020, but we're not going to think about 2020 in 2021. So, but yeah, make sure see you at the symposium. Thank you, John, for coming on tonight, but also thank you for also joining us and being available next May as we push back the symposium. But
my pleasure. My pleasure.
I'd like to end with one final thought or comment, John, about the topic tonight. We really appreciate your time, so I want to give you the chance for closing remarks.
Well, one thing I did, my book is, it's in the appendix, also in my book are African-American women who served with the Continental Army. There were thousands of women and children that were with the Army during the war. And I do have African-American women. One of them was actually a servant of Washington. She gave birth at Valley Forge to a son. And the other one actually gave in the pension papers the only known letter from a Black soldier home during the war, which I have in my book. And her name is Judith Lines.
Fine. So there you go. Another reason to pick up the book, not only for the main chapters, but also for dependencies, appendixes, excuse me. John also says he has a blog. And
yeah, I'll give you my blog post or the address of it to include too.
Perfect, and we'll include that up. And so, John, once again, thank you for this joining us for this great topic. On if we don't talk sooner, we look forward to seeing you next May in Alexandria, Virginia. So
excellent. Thanks so much, Phil. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And so everyone have a good night. Next week we talk about Revolutionary War in the West. So please join in next Sunday at 7 p.m. So we'll see you then. Take care and have a good, healthy and safe week.